Hello YouTube, Kevin here for Superpower Broadcasting. Today is the 19th of April 2019, and in this video I'm going to be discussing some of the aspects of the redacted version of the report on Russian collusion in the 2016 election, or the Mueller report. What's great about this, right, is that I'm led to believe by the Trump sycophants and the Jimmy Dore types and the Kyle Kulinski fanboys and all the Tanky Tulsi Gabbard followers and the Kremlin shill Jill Stein sycophants and all the RT subscribers out there, all the unironic viewers of Russia Today television, all of them, that this whole thing right from the get-go for years has just been a giant nothing burger. And I'm like, I haven't read the full report yet, the full redacted version of the report yet, but I have read a summary. I've read a few summaries of it, and I've been following the investigation for years now, even though I only just started talking about politics on YouTube a couple weeks ago. The thing is, this is, for a nothing burger, it's very, very, very juicy. And the only way you get juice out of a nothing burger is if you got meat or if you got sauce. But if it's a nothing burger, there's no meat or sauce. So what's the deal there? So, yeah, obviously it's not a nothing burger, and we knew. The thing is, we knew. Everybody that was paying attention, even before the probe was actually commissioned, before the special counsel was commissioned to actually conduct this investigation, we knew that Donnie Yesser Vladimir Putin was basically subservient to the president of fascist Russia. I mean, Trump on the campaign trail had spoken at length about how, Vladimir Putin, we should get along with him more. We should act more in his interests rather than our interests. Now, he didn't phrase it that way. He said that we should get along better or we should have closer ties, even though the world is not zero-sum. I'm not a Marxist like that, but in international relations, in the interactions between superpowers, to conceive of the world as zero-sum usually makes sense, and it's usually the case. On economics, zero-sum thinking is dumb, but on international relations, I think zero-sum thinking often makes a lot of sense. And so that's why I translate get along better with Russia as promote their interests rather than ours, because that's what happens. Because Putin isn't going to negotiate in good faith. Him, his buddy Kim, Assad, all those guys, they only take, they don't give, and they back off if they're challenged, but they don't give ground. That's the thing. They don't reach out to us. We are ultimately the ones that wind up having to reach out to them. And of course, in the case of Putin, the report has ultimately concluded a number of things. And one of the things that it concluded was that the government of the Russian Federation actually did attempt to meddle and undermine and ultimately direct the course of the 2016 elections. The only question, that was pretty obvious. Like, James Clapper has been out, and he used to direct the Central Intelligence Agency, so if anybody knew what they were talking about, this guy's seen how the Russian intelligence system works for decades. He knows the ins and outs. He can't get into it because it would reveal classified information, of course, but he knows. He knew. And if you watch him in interviews and whatnot, it's always kind of frustrating. And you feel vicariously frustrated watching James Clapper try to get across just the severity, just the magnitude of the issue, because he can't go into classified information. He's a professional. He's a professional with integrity. But he's just wanting to say there, like, look, Jake Tapper, or look over here, we know it's not a matter of debate. It's being disingenuous. And I feel that, and it's often the case that the people that did claim it was a nothing burger often made the case that, well, they would be right to do it. It goes back to this idea of something that Christopher Hitchens pointed out, that he would often talk about how dictatorships and regimes such as Saddam Hussein and whatnot would claim things like, we didn't throw gay people off of roofs, or we didn't gas people. Like that's Western propaganda. We didn't do it. And then in the next statement they would say, somebody needs to deal with those people, or if we did do it, we would have been in the right to do it. That sort of thing. Assad has done similar, He denies the chemical weapons attack, but then he says, oh yeah, but we need to kill all of the resistance, basically. So this is a duplicitous, doublespeak type thing. And so a lot of the Trump sycophants, they'll usually deny the veracity of the report. They denied the veracity of the Steele document. They went so far as to saying that the whole thing was fake news. That it was all paid for by Hillary Clinton. Which, if you believed it, it's one thing. Like, if you actually believed that it was fake news and you thought that there was nothing there, that's one thing. I would think that would be the case of great ignorance, and that you should probably look into more of the details from reputable news sources and different news sources, so that you can kind of get in a sense for your own self of kind of what happened, or a rough idea of the events, and judge for yourself what might seem credible or not. I'm not saying that the Moscow hotel thing is necessarily entirely credible, but some of the aspects in there, such as I believe it was Carter Page meeting with Russians in Czechoslovakia, turned out to be confirmed. So it wasn't fake news in that regard. Most things that were looked into, almost everything that was actually seriously looked into, turned out to be true. And Papadopoulos went to jail, and yet they still claim fake news. But it's one thing to claim fake news and have that be because you don't know about what actually happened, or you didn't hear about, oh, well, this is actually proven true. That's actually kind of understandable, especially if you only watch Fox News or if you only follow Trump on Twitter. It would make sense that if you live in that kind of echo chamber, you might say it's fake news. I get that. I think that you should do more research, but that's at least something that makes sense. But then you have all these people saying it's a nothing burger, like the Jimmy Dore fans, or the Kyle Kulinski fans, or the Kremlin shill Jill Stein fans, or the Tanky Tulsi Gabbard fans, or the Russia Today subscribers. And there's usually a massive overlap between all of those, basically, where they'll say, oh yeah, it's fake, like it's a nothing burger, it's overhyped, if there's anything there, it's just the Democrats doing trying to defend themselves because they lost in 2016. They'll deny the veracity, they'll mitigate it, or they'll just outright say that it's fake news of the entire probe into Russian collusion. And then they'll go on to make the statement, basically as an analogy to what I was talking about how Hitchens pointed this out with dictator apologists and their regimes, how they'll do this doublespeak. They'll go on and immediately then say, we should be closer with Russia, and the West is wrong in Syria and should leave Syria, and we should get out of Ukraine. That's Putin's backyard. We should let him have Eastern Europe. NATO expanded and it shouldn't have, and Bush promised Gorbachev that NATO would never expand, and it did. And so the U.S. is in the wrong, and U.S. is imperialist. And they do this whole Russia good, USA bad narrative, and you're like, you listen to this, and you're like, wait, so you're saying that the whole thing's fake, and it's fake news. But then they're also alleging, basically, or they're making the claim that, and they don't say this explicitly, of course, because that would be ridiculous, but they, in essence, are implying to you, well, if it was true, it would be a good thing. And so if somebody is denying something, but then they advocate for all of the things that are claimed in that, as if they did happen, that would be good, well, at that point, they're just doing it for political reasons. And they're doing it to be cued. Because at the end of the day, keep it real. People like Jimmy Dore, people like Stephen Russia Good, USA Bad Cohen, people like Alex Lost My Kids to Own the Libs Jones, people like Kremlin shill Jill Stein, she had dinner with Putin. I mean, so for them to go and deny the veracity of the report, for them to deny the veracity of the probe, for them to deny the legitimacy of the probe, for them to just dismiss all of this as essentially fake news and mitigate it, and ultimately do a lot of apologia for Putin. Well, at the same time, of course, they'll deny it, but then they'll say, well, yeah, but if Trump did collude with Russia, it would be a good thing. Well, then I say, well, now all of a sudden that's kind of a conflict of interest in a sense, because I'm not going to take it seriously if you deny the veracity of the probe, but then you say, yeah, but if he colluded, he would have been right to do it. Because at that point, that's actually giving credence to the idea that the Russians didn't even necessarily need to directly co-opt Trump. So the report, to some extent, that we've seen in the redacted version, it removes the possibility of conviction or charging Trump with collusion with Putin directly. And that makes sense to me. I'd be shocked. I'd be totally shocked if Trump and Putin talked on the phone and plotted, how they were going to rig an election. That's just not how it works. I have been following this thing for a long time. The problem wasn't that Putin and Trump called each other and figured out how to rig an election or something. It was that the Russians have been having Trump as their financial agent, basically, for over a decade. And so Trump, right after the 6 bankruptcies, he could not get financing anywhere. But he's not actually that rich. So if he wants to do all this stuff like the golf courses and the airplanes and the Trump steak and the Trump water and the whole Sharper Image contract, and he wants to, partner up with all these kinds of companies and everything and go around touting himself as this huge successful businessman, well, he needs loans because he's actually in a huge amount of financial hot water. So, but nobody's going to lend him loans. That's the problem. But then, fortunate enough for him, the Russian Federation lends him a bunch of money. The oligarchs lend him a bunch of money. The Russian banks, Alpha Bank, lends him hundreds of millions of dollars, basically. And so at this point, you're in a situation where you could argue, if you were going to defend Trump, you could say, well, there's nothing wrong with getting money from a bank. What happens if that bank just so happens to be in Russia? That's not a big deal. You could get money from a Saudi bank. You could get money from a British bank. You could get money from a Canadian bank. Why are you picking on Russia? Well, the problem is he couldn't get money from any of those other banks. Nobody else would lend him money. Why would the Russian banks do it? Is it because they're stupid? No, they're not stupid. It's because they're all connected to Putin. So Alpha Bank is the largest quote-unquote private bank in Russia. But you don't get to be the largest private bank in Russia without kissing Putin's behind. Like, they're all sycophants. They all sing praise of Putin, and the second any of them crosses Putin the wrong way, they go from having $15 billion to running for Switzerland for their lives and worrying if their soup's going to be poisoned with plutonium. Like, the whole system revolves around Vladimir Putin. You don't get to be anybody in Russia without taking orders from Putin. So nothing's private. The whole system is, in essence, is a fascist oligarchy that revolves around the great leader, Putin. It's almost entirely it's almost entirely autocratic at this point. And what's amazing about this is that there are people out there that buy into the narrative of Russia good, USA bad, that will go out there and say, oh, well, Hillary got money from banks too, or, well, don't you have a mortgage from a bank or whatever? As if they do the false equivocation, as if those are the same thing. The only way that would be a comparable analogy is if the only place that Clinton could get money from was whatever bank she was getting money from. Or if the only place that you could get your mortgage from was, say, a Russian bank or something, then that would be suspicious. So what it gives the appearance of is that any reasonable person who's paying attention and follows the news would infer that there's probably an ulterior motive behind the lenders taking a risk on Donald Trump because they knew they weren't going to make their money back. And so why would you, if you're a banker and you wanted to be successful, why would you lend money to somebody who's gone bankrupt 6 times, is clearly insolvent, has no regard for integrity, for their shareholders, constantly shifts employees, contractors, etc., refuses to pay them for work done, refuses to compensate them for services rendered. It just goes on and on. The track record of Trump's just total greed, malfeasance, but it's not just greed. Greed in itself is not illegal. It's that he'll hire contractors to fix up his plane for $80,000 or carpenters, and then he just won't pay them. Like, he's not actually a billionaire. He's in a lot of debt. It would shock me if he had anywhere above zero as a net worth. I mean, he's been $3 billion in the red before as a net worth. My guess is he's closer to that end than he is to being at the 0 point. The thing is, if you're one of those banks, if it was anybody else, you just simply would not lend them money. You couldn't justify, if you're a financial officer at a bank, you could not justify underwriting that loan. It would be the end of your career. And if it wasn't the end of your career, pretty soon it would be the end of the company that you worked for. Because, it turns out Donnie went bankrupt the 7th time. Well, no, the thing is, the reason why they did it wasn't to make money off of him. It was to get compromise and to money launder. Because if you're one of those oligarchs in Russia, if you keep all your money in Russia, well, Putin can take it. He's the Leviathan. He could turn you from $15 billion to nothing, to being a gulag prisoner overnight. He's done it before. And you can look into the history of some of the oligarchs that have all of a sudden caught the disfavor of Putin. They go from being some of the richest people in the world to being basically destitute and fearing for their lives and having to flee in exile. This is how the Putin system works. This is how Russia's always worked. This is just a modern version of it, of course. But it's not like the Soviets were much different. It's not like the Tsars were much different. They've always been an autocracy in essence. And so, and they've always had that oligarchical system, but where the oligarchs are ultimately fragile and where the oligarchy as a class continues, but individual oligarchs can get purged anywhere. This happened with the Boyars and even the Terrible. It just goes back hundreds of years of the Russian system ultimately being about the glorification of one person, in this case Vladimir Putin. So for Trump, for all these banks, for all of them, one, their motivation is to get the money out of the country, because even if they lose money on it, it's better having some money abroad than maybe making a profit but then losing all of it if you curry the disfavor of Putin. So with Trump, in the case of Trump, they did it for that reason, of course, to get the money out of the country. They bought real estate, overinflated in the U.S., just so that they could get as much money out of the country as possible, art, etc. They funded Trump's golf courses. Trump's son, I believe it was Eric Trump. It was the dumb one. He was giving an interview to a golf magazine a few years back, and they asked him, well, where do you guys get the financing for these golf courses from? And he said, we get them from the Russians. And they're like, what? And he's like, yeah, they like golf. And like, Shane Guger, he points this out on Young Turks. He says, nah, they don't give you hundreds of millions of dollars because they like your golf course. That's not how this works. It's to get the money out of the country because it's dirty money. They rob the entire people. The average Russian, their average salary right now is about $9,900 a year in 2019 U.S. money. You know what it was in 1989, like 30 years ago under communism? It was about $10,000 a year in 2019 U.S. money. So the average Russian is 1% poor now, 30 years on. They went down. They live 3 years shorter now than they did under communism. And they have to retire a year later than they did under communism. And communism sucked. But the modern Russian Federation sucks even more. This is how much they've robbed the country. The whole country. 145 million people. One of the largest economies in the world. I believe it's either the 8th or the 10th largest economy. All leached by about 3,000 families. 3,000 people. With the primary benefiter being Vladimir Putin, who has a net worth of about $2 trillion. It turns out, actually, there is a way that you can become a trillionaire. People think, Bill Gates is the richest person in the world, or Jeff Bezos is the richest person in the world. I'm like, No, those people are like McDonald's employees compared to Putin. You can be a trillionaire very easily. You just rob an entire country of life, liberty, and the fruits of their labor for 20 years, as Putin has done. And you can have $2 trillion too. I mean, he's like 20 times richer than Bill Gates, and that's just an estimate. It could be a lot more than that. Stalin controlled about $7 trillion in assets, for example, when he died. Sure, he only had a few kopecks in his pocket when he died, and it's not like he had it in liquid cash or anything. But and it's a similar case with Putin. But in terms of the amount of money and the amount of financial power that he personally controls, it's somewhere on the order of about $2 trillion. A lot of it's in offshore bank accounts. Some of it's tied up in physical assets like the yachts, the mansions, etc. But yeah, that's how you do it. If you keep a country 1% poorer over 30 years from where they were when they started, and you graft all that money and give a tiny bit of it to your key supporters so you can hold on to power, like the leaders of the church, the Orthodox Church in Russia, one of the most corrupt religions, basically, organized religions. If you pay off some of the corporate heads of, say, like Nornickel and the other oligarchs, Deripaska, Abramovich, all these other ones, you only really need to keep a few keys to your power. In other words, you can control a country of about 145 million people and only really have to pay off about 3,000 people altogether. And that system can be relatively stable until you die. That's what Putin's proved. And he's grafted the fruits of the Russian people's labor for decades. And so Trump, they loan this money to Trump. Well, they're not doing it to make a profit. They're doing it in case he becomes the president. It's a smart investment. And I'm not talking they make their money back. Because even though he's president, they're not going to make their money back. That, like, those golf courses, they're not making their money back on that. Those were simply a way to get compromise, to buy influence, to make it so that Trump, if he ever does anything, steps out of line, say, for example, say he liberates Iran or takes out Maduro in Venezuela. Well, now the Russians have dirt, and they can say to Trump, hey, if you start this war with our ally and you liberate the Venezuelan people or you liberate the Iranian people, we're going to leak all the tax return data. We're going to leak all the money laundering data. They did it so that they could get dirt. It's not even like they were doing it to help Trump personally. They were doing it to serve their own ends. They don't actually care about Trump. And that's the whole thing. So Trump didn't actually have to collude with them in the sense of have a phone conversation, talk about how they're going to rig the election. They just had to underwrite all these fraudulent loans, in essence, all these money laundering transactions to him to buy dirt, to get compromise, so that if he becomes president, well, you don't need to have that phone call. He knows what to do. He's yes, sir, Vladimir. He doesn't need to say yes, sir, Vladimir, because he'll do your bidding. And they were successful with it. And that's a part of the asymmetric warfare that I talk about, where Russia's military sucks and Putin knows it sucks. Like, sure, he does all the parades. He goes to, like, their whole navy and everything, and all the people, he gets them to act all patriotic and all that. But he knows the U.S. Navy is better. He knows that the Italian Navy would blow their Tin Pot Navy out of the water. He knows that. The whole thing is just a show to keep the people in line. It's just like North Korea. The Korean People's Army, they don't have those old school tanks, and they don't have, the Korean People's Air Force doesn't have those propeller planes from the 1940s to take down F-35s with if a war breaks out. That military, all those military assets exist to keep the people in line, because their military would get blown out of the water if the U.S. went to war with them. But if you're an average starving North Korean peasant and you try to rise up, well, I got news. Even a World War II era piece of mechanized military equipment, that will crush you. A sword can kill you. They don't actually need an advanced army to keep the people in line, because that's the name of the game, is to keep the people starved in fear and ultimately try to get the masses emboldened and patriotic and whatever. And so the military, just as in Russia, it largely exists as just a propaganda piece. It's like a Potemkin village, basically. The whole thing is just, it's a show. It's a facade. And Putin, he's smart. He knows it. So what does he do? He invests in cyber warfare for decades, which was smart. And he's more advanced than the U.S. is now. And he tries to buy off influence from prominent U.S. people that he thinks have a chance at coming into power. And Trump, sure, it was a long shot or whatever, but the thing is, it's not like if he didn't become president or if he didn't run for president that none of this would have happened. Because let's say that Trump never ran for president. They still would have done all the money laundering. Because that was the original aim of the game, was just to get the money out of the country. When it turned out he was running for president, now all of a sudden there's an even bigger incentive in order to, continue on with the relationship. And so Putin will throw Trump under a bus so fast. Say for example that Trump, stations nuclear weapons in Estonia. Or say he stations nuclear weapons, say for example, he stations nuclear weapons in Taiwan. Or say he stations nuclear weapons or in Latvia. Or say for example, he invades Iran. Or he liberates Venezuela. I can go on. Putin will leak all the dirt and cause chaos in America and get Trump impeached. And that's the whole point. Because the whole point in backing Trump politically wasn't because Putin likes Trump as a person. It was to cause division in America. It was to weaken America and to tear apart the social fabric and the liberal values of the West. To make Russia look better. Because Russia sucks. So the only way that Russia gets good PR is if they can make us look bad. Because they can't make themselves look good. And because their economy is dismal, it's over 50% reliant on gas prices and oil prices, and those are very fluctuatory, and it's very possible that will be the downfall of the entire system, that they could go bankrupt if the oil markets go the wrong way in their view. They are basically an ultra-conservative, far-right petrol state that has a few nice skyscrapers in Moscow and a couple nice skyscrapers in St. Petersburg and about 3,000 families that have like Rolls Royces and Bentleys and stuff. And apart from that, the rest of the country is just desolate. It's 145 million people who make less now than they did 30 years ago, live 3 years less than they did 30 years ago. And by the way, life expectancy is short. It's like in the 60s. It's lower than North Korea. I mean, think about that. North Korea is the worst place to live. But you'll live longer in North Korea on average than you will in Russia. Think about how disgraceful that is. And that's all because of Putin looked at the opportunity cost and said, well, I'm going to graft. And he grafted, and he took the money, and he acted corrupt. And I know he justified it by saying, well, if it's not me, somebody else will take me out and do it themselves. And he was right, because Russia's been an autocracy for 1,000 years. It's not like if Putin decided to be altruistic that he would prevail. Somebody would purge him and take over and do it again. Because the only way that we fix Russia is with an external intervention. That's part of the reason why Westphalianism is such a dumb way of looking at the world. Because some countries actually need help. They need guidance in terms of setting up the institutions for long-lasting democracy. It's very hard to do on your own, especially the longer you go. And so, in the case of Trump, for example, with this report, everything that it's shown, well, Mueller has stated now that he cannot clear Trump of obstruction. The report is ambivalent about the obstruction case and basically argues that if you could indict a sitting president, you'd probably indict him on obstruction charges. And so Mueller clears him on collusion, but doesn't clear him on obstruction. And so that begs the question then, well, if you're Trump and you know you're innocent of collusion, and it appears he is, in all fairness to Trump, it appears that he never got on the phone and talked with Putin and asked him to rig the election or whatever. It just doesn't look like that happened. If you're innocent, and you know you're innocent, why would you then go and fire the FBI director investing you? If you're innocent and somebody accuses you of something, You want to be investigated so that you can be exonerated sooner. You can be vindicated. And then you can go on Twitter and point out about how all your opponents are a bunch of hacks. That's what Trump would have wanted to do, right? But he didn't. He wanted to shut down the whole thing. He didn't want to be vindicated. And you're like, wait, but the dude's innocent. And it appears here that he's totally innocent on the collusion case. Well, the reason why he obstructed, the reason why he tried to shut it down was because he thought that Mueller was going to look into his financial records. He thought that Mueller was going to look into his past transactions with the Russians. It doesn't look like Mueller did. It looked like Mueller saw the scope of his investigation as being, see if they teamed up to rig the election. And it doesn't look like that happened. But you can still have an issue if the president is in debt to the Russian oligarchy. That's still a conflict of interest. And it's still a violation. In many ways, Trump's already violated the emoluments clause, even putting all this other stuff aside, just on his hotels and everything. But this gets into the issue of possible treason, etc. The problem, of course, is that when Trump heard that he was being investigated, he immediately thought, oh, dang, they're going to find the dirt. They're going to find all the loans that they gave me to launder money. That's not going to look good. That's why Trump says, quote, I'm effed when he finds out about it. That's one of the juicy parts of the report that came out. Again, if it's a nothing burger, it's a pretty juicy nothing burger, right? There's a lot of sauce. There's a lot of meat in there for a nothing burger. I mean, it's like a 30-pound burger, but apparently I'm led to believe that it's nothing. You know? It's like, it's such a mess. And so, with respect to the issue of the obstruction, the only way that he risks all of that, the only way that he does all of this, is if he thought he was guilty. And so it looks like he's innocent, but he thought he was guilty. The report, if you put the obstruction aside, says he's innocent in essence. But Trump thought he was guilty, otherwise he wouldn't have obstructed. So that can only mean one thing. The report had a very limited, and the investigation had a very limited mandate to investigate the election. Trump thought that they were going to look into the full background with the Russians, and he freaked out. Lucky for him, they didn't. But, given all of this, a reasonable person would assume, well, if you're innocent, and you're basically trying to fire the people that are cooperating with the investigation, you're trying to end the investigation, you're doing all this obstructionary action, why? That's not what an innocent person would do, and it's simple. He's innocent of collusion, and he's guilty of money laundering and being financially in debt and in service to the government of the Russian Federation via their proxies and the oligarchs and their state-controlled banks, basically. Private bank. Yeah, right. Alpha Bank is as private as any of those Chinese government companies. They're as private as Huawei. I mean, come on. They are an agent of the Kremlin. You don't get to be that big without being an agent of the Kremlin, because they'll shut you down, just like they do with any independent media. They'll shut you down once you get to be too big. And so that whole thing was a proxy for Putin's will. And Trump believed that that was going to be investigated. Mueller didn't look into it. But Trump knew he was innocent of the collusion. The only way that he would obstruct is if he thought he was guilty. Well, he thought that they were going to look into other stuff, and so that's why he didn't want to be vindicated on the collusion, because he was worried about being indicted on the money laundering. And so, what does this mean for the state of the West, for the state of NATO right now? Well, it means simple, that Trump is so much in service to Russia that they didn't even need to collude with him. He knows what to do. He's pulled out of Syria. He hasn't done anything about Venezuela. He has, in many cases, done the exact thing that Russia wanted. He's gone out and shilled for Kim Jong-un and written beautiful love letters to Kim Jong-un, which is an ally of Russia. He has basically stayed out of Syria, except for a couple nominal strikes on like random air bases that were inconsequential. He's been isolationist, basically. He's badmouthed NATO. He's questioned the legitimacy of NATO. He's peddled the Russia good, USA bad narrative many times. He's done positive PR for Vladimir Putin. He takes Vladimir Putin's word. He takes KGB Vlad's word over James Clapper's word. He takes KGB Vlad's word over the word of 17 U.S. intelligence agencies. He trusts the modern KGB over the CIA. That's how in-depth this guy is. You don't need to collude with that guy. He's already in your court. There was no need for that phone conversation. There was no need to directly collude with him because he was already an agent of the Kremlin by that point. And so in the case of this whole situation now, he's not going to get impeached because it clears him on the collusion. But it doesn't clear him on the obstruction, but I don't think that people are going to see it as big a deal. But I think that people should see it as a bigger deal because it was unlikely that he directly colluded. Of course, we know, and this is another part of the whole nothing burger line that's ridiculous, is that the investigation turned up a lot of actual something burgers, such as Paul Manafort working for KGB Vlad in Ukraine for a long time, making all that money, and then not reporting it, and doing all kind of dictator apologia. It revealed the Carter Page, that Carter Page is a Putin apologist and a shill, and he was in the Trump campaign. It revealed the Papadopoulos revelations. It revealed that the Trump team tried to amend the Republican platform to advocate for acknowledging Russia as the legitimate controller of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. The whole thing was a pro-Russian agenda that they tried to push for. And so even if Trump didn't personally get involved in that stuff, and I mean, the guy's not that competent, the guy's not that bright, the guy doesn't have that big of an attention span, he likes to think about golf, cheeseburgers, etc., tweets. His team, the Trump campaign, was infested with people that had relationships with the government of fascist Russia that you just haven't seen in any other campaigns. Like, imagine if Ronald Reagan, imagine if his team, half of his team were people that were, friends and buddies with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Cold War probably would have ended differently. Maybe the Soviets win. Maybe Reagan comes out and says, oh yeah, we need to get along better with the Soviet Union. We could learn a lot from them, maybe we should try out the no term limits thing, which is something that Trump has said. There's so many aspects of this where the guy's already got an authoritarian aesthetic, and he's already got all these values that co-align with fascist Russia and their agenda, that there wasn't really any much of a need to co-opt him directly. Because he was already in their core, and he was basically an indentured servant to the Kremlin because they were the only people that would lend money to him. And it's a tragic state right now because this report is going to give a lot of fuel to the people like Jimmy Dore, Kyle Kulinski, Kremlin shill Jill Stein, Tanky Tulsi, the quote-unquote progressive, useful idiot anchors on Russia Today, where they're going to say, oh, it was the establishment, and the establishment bungled this, and they made up all this to try to explain why Clinton lost. And I'm like, nah, if you think this was a nothing burger, you're actually definitely shilling for the establishment. You just happen to be shilling for the Russian establishment, not the American establishment. And guess what? That's an establishment that sends people to gulags and represses women's rights, etc. Sends the Pussy Riot people to jail for 2 or 3 years just for accessing free speech. The American establishment, on the other hand, looks like a bunch of weed-toking hippies in comparison to how ultra-conservative the Russian establishment is, with the intertanglement between the corrupt Russian Orthodox Church and the corrupt Kremlin. The whole thing is just, to see people who call themselves progressives who defend the Russian establishment over the American establishment. I'm like, I'll take the American establishment over the Russian establishment any day. I'll take our establishment over the Syrian establishment any day. I'll take the Western establishment over the North Korean establishment any day. Like 1,000 times out of 1,000. It's not even a contest. I mean, if you're anybody that has any liberal sensibilities to you, you'd be disgusted by these fascist systems and how they're trying to co-opt and subvert democracy and undermine the social fabric of the Western Hemisphere because they know they can't win a war with NATO conventionally. And we're all just going to pretend that this clears everything and everything's all good now and we can actually go and defend Russian interests and not worry about it. It's just, I mean, again, to see people who denied all the allegations and then at the same time made the case that the allegations should be true because Russia's the good guy and we're the bad guy and we're imperialist pigs and they're great and they're fighting for the white people and the white Christians and we're bad and degenerate. Like all these quote-unquote progressives and paleo-conservatives and libertarians and Cal Kulinski and the Jordan Peterson fanboys, Jimmy Dore fanboys, Tanky Tulsi, all of them, the dictator apologists across the board, all of them now, they're going to say, oh yeah, there was no collusion, but let's collude, we should collude. That's their argument basically. And I say, it's a bad time. This was one of the main motivations that led me to create this channel because I'm independent. Nobody tells me what to report on. Nobody tells me what to talk about. Nobody tells me what perspective to give. I'm out here and I'm calling BS and I'm going to hold the Russian establishment to account as best as I can. So I would say, I don't usually try to get subscribers or anything, or try to get famous or any of that. But if you want somebody who's going to be a staunch cold warrior, who's going to be out here calling out all of the duplicity and all of the moral degeneracy of fascist Russia and their asymmetric assault on the West and their constant act of war against the West, everything from using weapons of mass destruction on British soil and getting away with it to ultimately undermining American democracy and getting away with it, to propping up dictators everywhere from Venezuela to Syria to North Korea, to pushing all these alt-right narratives online, to being the sole and largest sponsor of the anti-feminist movement, funding all kinds of anti-feminist campaigns and mimetic assaults. If you're somebody who's disgusted by that and is sick and tired of the West pretending the Cold War's been over for 30 years when it never actually ended, and the only thing that changed was that Russia transitioned from communism to fascism, but they still see us as the enemy and still desire to take over the West and undermine the West. If you're somebody that has liberal values, if you're somebody that believes in the idea of rule of law, if you're somebody who believes in the idea of accountable government, independent branches of government, the democratic process, the idea of free enterprise, the idea of ultimately what I would argue moral universalism, the idea that whites shouldn't be the only ones that get human rights, I would say, you probably get a lot out of subscribing to this channel. And if you are somebody who, watches Jimmy Dore or Kyle Kulinski or whatever, and you're kind of on the fence, I'd say subscribe to this channel too. Because guess what? I watch Jimmy Dore, I watch Kyle Kulinski quite often. And I think it's important to have those kind of counterweights. I do it to keep up with the talking points of my opponents. But back before I had this channel, I used to watch them too. Sometimes I found some of their stuff kind of entertaining. But the older I got, the more and more that I watched them. I went from being 21 and finding a lot of their stuff pretty funny to being 25 and finding a lot of their stuff really morally duplicitous and kind of disgusting. And oftentimes being of the implicit argument that we should condemn every black and brown person in the world to live under despots, but but we can have human rights for whites in the West. I'm like, no, I'm a globalist. Like, this whole thing isn't over. The whole goal right now is to try to get to a point where the whole world is one country with a liberal democratic system, and where the West, there is no West, because the West is in the East, the West is in the North, the West is in the South. the planet's round, right? Like, unless you're one of those flat earthers, right? The planet's round. The whole thing. Morally universalist system where everybody has the same rights, and where nowhere in the world can you be disappeared in the middle of the night because somebody in your family was accused of stealing a piece of corn or something, or not dusting the great leader's portraits well enough. And so all these Jimmy Dore fanboys, all the Kremlin Shill Jill Stein fanboys, she has dinner with Vladimir Putin and Michael Flynn, and so she hangs out with the far right and the far left. All these people out there that have this that have bought into this narrative of Russia good, USA bad, whether they come at it from the quote-unquote progressive side, or they come at it from the Orthodox Christian side, or they come at it from the alt-right side where they're atheists but they want a state religion because it's easier to control and keep the people in line. Or you have the communists or the fascists or the white supremacists or the radical nationalists. You have the like most identity politics movements today. You have the MRAs, all these people that have bought into this narrative, the libertarians, all of them that have bought into this narrative of Russia good, USA bad, the US is an imperialist actor, Russia's good, they're the savior, they're the morally righteous party. Well, I'm going to be out here stating facts because, you know, as Ben Shapiro says, facts don't care about your feelings, and it's a fact that only about 3% of Russians attend church on a monthly basis or more regularly, whereas in America about 30% do. Now, I'm not Christian, but if I were, I'd be saying America's about 10 times more faithful than Russia there. So this whole narrative of Russia as the savior is concocted in the Internet Research Agency's headquarters in St. Petersburg, funded by the Kremlin, directed through the GRU, the whole thing, all this right now. So much of what you see, so much of the toxicity from YouTube. I know YouTube has a definite MRA bias, it has a definite anti-feminist bias. I don't care. I'm out here, I'm independent, I'm giving you my take as I see it, and I am unabashedly pro-West, I'm unabashedly pro-American, I'm unabashedly anti-fascist, I'm unabashedly anti-communist, I am unabashedly anti-socialist, I am, you know, as the channel says, socially liberal, economically liberal, and somewhere between a liberal hawk and a neoconservative on foreign policy. So if you want to see a channel, if you want to see somebody who doesn't follow the party line in any regard, I'd say, you know, you'd probably be well served subscribing to this channel right now, because we are at Superpower Broadcasting here trying to wake the West up to something that if we don't actually get smart to this, and we let all these disingenuous people who deny the Mueller report, the veracity of it, but then say, well, if it was true, it would be good because Putin's actually the good guy and we're the bad guys. If we let those people, if we let that seep in long enough, pretty soon we might wind up looking like Russia. And that's not the world that I want to live in. And if I ever had kids, that's not the world that I want them to live in. I want it so that my grandkids' can grow up in a liberal democracy. And hopefully that liberal democracy will just be the planet. That's what I want. And I am out here calling out hypocrisy on the left, the right, wherever. And so I would recommend, if you guys could, definitely subscribe, because this channel, this isn't going to stop. I'm going to keep doing this. And hopefully one day we will be able to purge out all of these pernicious elements that try to ultimately undermine our civilization in essence. Like, this is a battle of civilizations in many ways between the liberal West and fascist Russia. And if you're anybody with a liberal sensibility, if you're anybody that believes in things such as feminism, if you believe in things such as capitalism, if you believe in the right to private property, if you believe in the right to not be arbitrarily detained and tortured, if you believe in all these various aspects of what it means to have human rights and to be a citizen of a Western democracy, well, I would recommend that you follow me. So thank you for watching YouTube.